about, but I genuinely think multiple options exist.
Mm-hmm.
You could undertake this in different ways that would be equally valid and legitimate. Instinctively, I would think ideally such an initiative should be tackled by the conference, by the national conference, by the National Conference of Bishops. Given the nature of the event, given the nature of the restrictions and the response, I mean, it was global in scale.
Mm-hmm.
So to have one province or one diocese or a couple of dioceses doing things jointly or individually, I don't see that as ideal. I think it should come, personally, I think it should come from the conference. If it came from the conference, there are different ways you could structure it. They could strike a task force, strike a committee. There could be a specific ad hoc group that's given a very specific mandate in terms of reference. Alternatively, the conference could hire an independent persons to do the initiative on their behalf with a very clear mandate from the conference. Ideally, that's what I would like to see. I think that's what the church institutionally, and I think that's what the faithful, the church, the faithful, the body, I think that's what is deserved and warranted. Seeing as it affected everybody. Everybody was affected in some measure, and people had different opinions. I'm sure we can go around the table, and each parish, there was a variety of opinions. And who was articulating those opinions may have surprised you. I know I was surprised by friends, family, and strangers. The views that were taken, I would not have anticipated certain people. But that's all to say, it affected everybody. We all had skin in the game. I think an initiative along these lines, to be effective and credible, it should come from the conference. And there are different ways you could structure it. I would also conclude by saying there would have to be some kind of means for input and consultation. That's not to say, I forget how many Catholics there are in Canada. It's not to say of the millions of Catholics in Canada, everybody gets a seat at the table, 30 seconds at the microphone. That's not practical. But there should be some kind of opportunity where input and consultation with clergy, with laity, and I think there are different ways you can structure that, and it would be credible.
One of the things that, because of this pandemic, nobody knew what to do. Government, church leaders, they're all tied. They couldn't figure out what the heck they were going to do. One of the advantages of listening to some of what the government allowed, there was opportunity for sacraments to be done. And I was lucky enough to read about parking lot celebrations. And when we were only allowed 5 and 10 people in our churches, I had 300 for the weekend because of what I learned. But I was lucky to have a bishop who was allowing me to do this. Some dioceses were not allowed to even do that. I had a parking lot confessions. I had a drive-by confessions, and people were they were actually more like 8 to 12 feet away because I had passenger window to passenger window, and there was nobody who could hear the conversation. I'm hearing a lot of listening to the priest here. There's times when bishops didn't really want to understand what was going on, not to knock them down. I'm not putting them under the bus, but there was other ways in doing it. Unfortunately, the information, even when I told people I was doing it, some just didn't want to do it that way.
Yeah, and that's all fair. I think, and rest assured, I'm not going to get on a soapbox and relitigate and Monday morning quarterback this stuff. But I think a couple of thoughts. For me, and I know others, there's the fundamental question of, in a moment of crisis, in a moment of calamity, how should the church respond? I think it's fair to have a general idea. I think it's also fair to say and to acknowledge, given the mission of the church and what the church is, its essence, how it responds to a crisis will probably be different than other worldly and secular institutions. And we should be ready for that. If they go in a certain direction, at some point, I would say at a very early point, that becomes irrelevant. They have a different mandate, they have a different mission, they're constituted very differently. So my hope would be that at a minimum, lessons and acknowledgements like this can be something we take away from the experience of the pandemic. I had another thought, which was, and I want to be clear, I would say, again, for what it's worth, personally, for the year 2020, early 2021, even at the time, and I know hindsight is always 2020, but even at the time, I was predisposed and inclined to be very charitable in extending the benefit of the doubt. Spring 2021, summer 2021, we had had enough experience with things where I think there could have been a firmer, more confident decision on the part of dioceses, parishes, and the like about what actions were going to be taken and what restrictions would be resisted. I would respectfully submit by summer 2021, enough had happened that we could be more confident. Yes, 2020 was a year of uncertainty, but things persisted, I would argue, longer than they should have. We had a federal election in September 2021. There was
2 minutes.
Yeah.
2 minutes.
Yeah. So that would be my response. Go ahead.
Thank you for taking the time to do the podcast. I humbly have one as well.
Okay.
Mine is not geared the way that yours is. Mine is meant to be kind of catapult, and God asked me to do it because I actually don't want to do it.
And the name of it is?
It's called God's Playbook.
God's Playbook. Okay.
It's for everyday people, and I do it every day, and it's a lot of work. So I'm thanking you because it's hard. Two, the idea of having guests, that's something that I struggle with, just getting people to come because I think everyone's so paranoid about being recorded. I'm thanking you for feeding I think a lot of priests listen to your podcast because it's not just for everyday people, although you might disagree. For me, it's actually not for priests, it's for everyday people. It's the opposite of I think what yours is or was. Or
I would readily acknowledge we were aiming for an audience that was more engaged, more informed, more interested than the average person.
So I'm just, on behalf of the church, thanking you because I know it's a lot of work
Yes.
and to be vulnerable, and you're also touching on difficult topics. And I wrote what might people think of you and your, whatever, and finding guests, whatever. So I just want to thank you for that.
Thank you. I appreciate the fellow podcaster solidarity. It is very difficult, and that's one of the reasons I had to step back. It's just a lot of work. It's a lot of work.
That's fine and up to you.
Yeah, no,
What?
just one more question, Justin.
I appreciate this time together with you. It's the first time I'm listening to you, and I'd be more interested to visit those podcasts. Now, as a federation, we are all representatives of our dioceses. So, how can we bring, especially this, evaluating the COVID and the impact on the people? So, you said it might come from the national for it to have the force, like doing that. But what do we do as representatives to take out from this so that we can begin that conversation?
Yeah, I think if we're going to look at an ideal or a hypothetical like the national conference undertaking a project of this nature, you got to work backwards. I mean, that's just not going to happen in a vacuum. Very likely or possibly it would be the fruit of individual priests, groups of lay people going to their pastors, going to the bishop and saying, you know what, we would like this, we think it's necessary, and to keep advocating for that and keep pushing. So I think it's going to have to be, I think if it happens, and the more time that passes, the more inclined I am to think that it probably won't happen. But if it does happen, I think it'll be largely influenced by a bottom-up exercise, by people on the ground, on the front lines, making noise, making arguments, saying that this would be very fruitful, this would be helpful, and we think it's necessary. So doing whatever you can in that regard. I mean, my understanding is that by virtue of your membership in the presbyteral councils, at various points, you do have an audience with the local bishop. I think just keeping the conversation live. And there can be different prudent ways to go about that. Sometimes it's looking for an opportunity. Maybe biding your time for a couple of weeks, a couple of months. Maybe if you live in a province where, I think in Alberta, for example, I think the Premier has been talking about amending the Bill of Rights and having vaccine exemption from mandatory medical procedures put in the Bill of Rights. That can be a timely opportunity or occasion for the faithful in Alberta to say, oh yeah, this is happening in the political arena. This is a good reminder that we need to have our own house in order. So I think looking for those types of opportunities where you can piggyback on something else, that can be a very effective tactic. If there's a change in government federally in a couple of months, maybe there will be something related to revisiting actions from the pandemic or some kind of measures that are put in place which are intended to be responsive to that. That could be a trigger. That could be a vehicle to piggyback on for action within our own church.
Thank you.
I will say, just while I have the microphone, I didn't mention this. In the Canadian Charter, this is in the theme of rediscovering and reclaiming stuff that we've forgotten. The opening words of the Canadian Charter, whereas Canada is founded upon principles that recognize the rule of law and the supremacy of God. When I mention this to coworkers and friends, they are stunned that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms acknowledges the supremacy of God. So if nothing else, let's take that home and start shouting that from the rooftops. Thank you again.